Sorry I didn't see you there. I was just sitting here by the fire in the bookshelf, reading one of my newest editions, Band of Brothers by Stephen E. Ambrose. If you didn't know, World War II is a pretty big interest of mine, and I've been spending the past few weeks reviewing the mini-series Band of Brothers, based on this very book. This episode, I'm really excited to include some excerpts from this book to support my findings and research that I've gotten from the internet and also from watching the series myself. Hi everyone! This week I'm back with a review of episode number 6 of Band of Brothers, called Bastogne. Here, we find the men of Easy Company camped out in foxholes in the Bois-Jacques forest right outside the town of Foy in Bastogne, Belgium. This episode, we're following Private Eugene Roe. He's a medic for Easy Company, and he's really showcased to be an absolute hero in this episode. The big problem that this episode presents is a lack of supplies across the board. The men of Easy Company don't have enough winter clothing for the cold December month that they're watching the town of Foy in the woods in the cold. They don't have enough ammunition, they don't have enough food, and they don't even have enough men. In the interviews that we've come to expect at the beginning of each episode, the veterans reflect on just how thinly the men were spread, how there were holes all along their defense, and how sometimes you didn't even know if you were in German territory or if you were in American territory. This is highlighted in the episode in an event that is actually almost a direct excerpt of the book. Let's go to reading Julia to find out more. At dawn on December 20th, a heavy mist hung over the woods and fields. Winters rose and looked around. To his left, he saw a German soldier in his long winter coat emerge from the woods. He had no rifle, no pack. He walked to the middle of the clearing. Two men with Winters instinctively brought their rifles to their shoulders, but he gave them a hand signal to hold their fire. The Americans watched as the German took off his overcoat, pulled down his pants, squatted, and relieved himself. When he was finished, Winters hollered in his best German, "Kommen Sie hier." The soldier put his hands up and walked over to surrender. We see Winters find this German in the snow, but in the episode it's presented just a little bit differently. He's with medic Eugene Roe, as he's the focus of this episode, so we see the two of them come across a German, just like the book explains. Winters does have his gun on the German. He does say, "Kommen Sie hier," and they search this German prisoner, and it's a big relief that Doc Roe gets a bandage from this prisoner, just one single German bandage. This, again, shows just how short they were on supplies and is very historically accurate to what the book is saying. That's what really gets me about this show, is the little moments directly taken from veteran experience and history that are described and displayed. There's even a scene later on where they mention the cook's beans as being not that great, but it's the only meal they're having for Christmas. That's right in the book. This show does such a good job of giving these authentic little moments that are real history, and now they're on the screen. Something that I'm going to talk about kind of in the second half of this review, where I'm talking about the cinematic and the entertainment value, is the relationship between Doc Roe and a Bastogne Belgian nurse named Renee Lemaire. These both were real people. We know Private Roe was a medic for Easy Company. Renee Lemaire is a Belgian nurse, and she was known as the Angel of Bastogne. So she's a real person, that was her real title, and this show chose to display her in this episode. Now, Doc Roe and Renee Lemaire probably didn't meet in real life. This is a choice the episode makes to explain the relationship of these heroes on both sides, on the front lines and kind of more behind the scenes. It's really effective in the moments these two share, but it's not something that really happened historically. The book, in its chapter covering Bastogne, only has one little paragraph about medic Doc Roe. The show, we know, takes that little paragraph and expands it to a whole story. We don't have his side of the story. We have excerpts from the book of people commending Roe on his bravery and his service, like this. Back again for another excerpt? Let me read to you what these men had to say about medics. The medics were the most popular, respected, and appreciated men in the company. Their weapons were first aid kits. Their place on the line was wherever a man called out that he was wounded. Lieutenant Foley had special praise for Private Eugene Roe. He was there when he was needed, and how he got there, you often wondered. He never received recognition for his bravery, his heroic servicing of the wounded. I recommended him for a Silver Star after a devastating firefight when his exploits were typically outstanding. Maybe I didn't use the proper words and phrases. Perhaps Lieutenant Dyke didn't approve. Or somewhere along the line it was cast aside. I don't know. I never knew, except that if any man who struggled through the snow and the cold, in the many attacks through the open and through the woods, ever deserved such a medal, it was our medic, Eugene Roe. So many things about this episode are historically accurate. I really relied on the Band of Brothers book to kind of compare the two. It must be noted that this book, while containing veteran testimonies and a lot of research, probably made some mistakes. You're not going to be able to rely on veteran testimonies or on historical accounts for every single moment in a soldier's life and in a soldier's day. It's just not going to happen. So there's a few discrepancies here and there, but overall, this episode and this show is just leaps and bounds above so many other war movies and period piece movies in the detail it goes to and in the history it portrays quite accurately and quite faithfully. So I want to go into a little bit more detail now about Eugene Roe and what his experience really shows us about this historical event. We really get into Doc Roe's head and see his mental strength. There's points, there's moments we can see he's right on the edge. He's on the edge of despair. He's on the edge of giving up. He's frustrated so often. He sees each soldier not just as a soldier, but as a man, and as a man whose life he is either going to save or who he can't save and will die directly because of his actions. Of course, he can't put all this pressure on himself. There's some wounds that can't be healed, but to go in to your job every day and be in charge of saving people's lives and not being successful in that, of course it's going to drive an individual to be frustrated and exhausted mentally, emotionally, physically. And on top of all the stuff he needs to do, he doesn't have a winter coat, he doesn't have gloves, he doesn't have the medical supplies he needs. He spends half of the episode going around asking soldiers for their little portions of morphine. He needs scissors, he needs more bandages. A few scenes that demonstrate just what's going on in Doc Roe's head really well are two times in particular where it takes him a moment to kind of jump into the action. One time we see him falling asleep in the snow, which is so peaceful and quiet in terms of the environment, and then you know the real situation, of course, is exactly the opposite. But we see him falling asleep, freezing, in a tiny little foxhole, and the screen fades to black, and then we see the transition to the next morning, and all you hear is a scream of medic. After a moment, and just almost like a sigh of, here we go again, Doc Roe jumps into action and does what is expected of him and what is demanded of him. He does his very difficult, very emotionally taxing and physically taxing job so well throughout the whole thing. The second time where we see him take a little minute before he gets into doing his job is when we see Harry Walsh get shot in his upper thigh. Everybody's calling for a medic, and Roe is just not wanting to get out of his foxhole. He's just so done. He's so beat up, so exhausted. So he takes a minute, almost refuses, and then it's as though a switch just flips and he's in go mode. And these little moments just really show how it never ends for him. It's not as though he saves one man and he gets to take a break. It's just such constant toil and such constant effort that he has to give. The opposite side to his efforts on the front line are presented in Renee. There's a really powerful conversation between Roe and Renee where they're sitting down in a brief moment of rest, and Renee is sharing chocolate with Roe, and he comments on her hands, which we can see dry blood just caked onto them, and he says, "You have healing hands, your touch soothes people." And he calls it a gift from God, and she explains, "No, this isn't a gift. God would never give something this painful." It's just this whole other perspective that we haven't yet been introduced to, but we're seeing now in this woman serving in a med station that's an old abandoned church. And we see her pain and her sorrow and the constant effort that she has to exert for these men who, this is as far as those men go. Roe's job is to take them off the front line, patch them up, and get them to further help. She is the further help, so there's a responsibility and a burden on her as well. We also see this pain and this despair when Roe and Renee work together to save a man by finding an artery, which they need to do in a very limited amount of time or else this man will bleed out and die. and they fail. And the camera just pauses on this moment of them staring at each other, and you can see the frustration and the angst in Eugene Roe, and you can see just the sadness and the hopelessness in Renee. And we know that these two understand each other, and they're few of the only two who do. One final thing about Eugene Roe and how this episode follows him and kind of differs him from the other soldiers that we've come to know is that the camera creates a very physical separation, which represents Doc Roe's mental separation from the other men. We see this after a particularly gruesome scene in which Roe is patching people up left and right. He is leaning against a tree all alone by himself while the other soldiers are gathering for a meal and joking and laughing. And it's not as though these soldiers are excluding Roe, it's that he is separated physically because of the headspace he is in. War wasn't easy for any of these men, but what we see here is Roe specifically just trying to stay distant and stay separate from these other men whose lives he's either going to end up saving or failing to save. Every soldier is afraid that their best friend is going to die, but for Eugene Roe, he realizes that if he had a best friend that had died, he sees it as there being more responsibility on his end that this individual died. Just one final thing I want to say in terms of the cinematic value of this episode is how this series as a whole, but how this specific episode uses blood and gore and violence. It's so not gratuitous. This being a series about the Second World War, there's no doubt that there's going to be a presence of that. The people working on this show respect the men whose lives they're portraying too much to make it about being entertained. It's violent and it's bloody and there's carnage, but it's for a greater purpose. They don't show injuries just for the sake of showing injuries. It's framed against the pain and discouragement and hopelessness and frustration that Doc Roe is facing in particular. So just to conclude, that's all I have to say about episode 6. This is my absolute favorite episode of the entire series. Doc Roe is one of my favorite characters, and again, I use that term lightly, realizing that Private Eugene Roe was a real person. I just love the emotional aspect that this episode portrays. I love the way everything is shown, the way we're taken on this mental journey, the inside look we get into this event. History-wise, cinematic engagement, entertainment value-wise, this episode just really nails it. They have so many little historical details in there. They have some amazing performances, not just by Shane Taylor as Roe, but by the whole cast who we've become pretty familiar with at this point. It's absolutely amazing, and I just don't have enough good things to say about it. Finally, next week I'll be back with review number 4, which will be my last review. Again, I'll be updating my Google spreadsheet with just a few notes, kind of a really super condensed version of what I've said here, along with numerical ratings for the categories that I've outlined. Thanks.